The air in the Paris criminal court was remarkably still on the morning of March the 16th, 2026. Outside, the city moved with its usual frantic pace, the sound of traffic and the distant hum of the metro providing a constant, low-level vibration. But inside the courtroom, the silence felt heavy, layered with the weight of a decade-long wait for justice. It was a typical early spring day when the proceedings began, a moment that many believed would never actually come to pass. In the center of the room stood an empty glass box, the prisoner's dock. It was a space designed to hold a man, yet it remained a void, a transparent cage for a phantom. This was the trial of Sabri Esid, a man known to some as Abu Dojana al-Faransi, and to others as a ghost who had haunted the nightmares of the Yazidi people for 12 long years. The story of how this empty chair came to represent France's first conviction for the Yazidi genocide begins not in the deserts of the Middle East, but in the quiet, familiar streets of France. Sabri Esid was born in 1984, growing up in a world that seemed entirely disconnected from the horrors he would later orchestrate. He was a son of France, a product of its schools and its cities, yet beneath the surface of a seemingly mundane life, a transformation was taking place. This was the kind of place where neighbors recognized one another, where the routine of daily life felt secure. But for Esid, the familiar was merely a mask. Investigators would later find that his radicalization wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, deliberate drift into the shadows of extremist ideology, a path that led him from the French suburbs to the very heart of the ISIS caliphate. In 2014, as the world watched the rapid and brutal expansion of the Islamic State across Iraq and Syria, Esid vanished from his home. He didn't just leave, he evaporated, leaving behind the safety of the West to pursue a dark vision of a new world order. By the time the French authorities realized the extent of his involvement, he had already risen through the ranks to become a prominent figure in the ISIS propaganda machine. Many viewed the footage coming out of the region with a sense of distant horror. But for the Yazidi community living on the slopes of Mount Sinjar, the nightmare was intimate and immediate. As ISIS forces swept across the landscape in August 2014, they carried with them a concerted plan, a systematic effort to erase an entire culture, a faith, and a people from the face of the earth. Sabri Esid was not merely a foot soldier in this campaign. He was an architect of misery. While many foreign fighters were prosecuted for general acts of terrorism, Esid's case was different. It was defined by a specific, calculated cruelty. Records show that he participated in the infamous slave markets, places where human life was reduced to a transaction, and where the dignity of women and children was berovered for a handful of currency. The prosecution would later argue that Esid didn't just witness the genocide, he facilitated it, buying and selling Yazidi survivors as if they were property, and subjecting them to years of systematic abuse within the confines of his own household. As you settle in tonight, perhaps adjusting your blankets or listening to the rhythmic rain against your window, it is worth reflecting on the contrast between your surroundings and the world these survivors were forced to inhabit. For 5 Yazidi women and their 8 children, the years between 2014 and 2016 were a blur of captivity and fear. They lived in a silence that few of us could imagine, a silence imposed by a man who believed he was untouchable. These women would eventually become the primary witnesses in a trial that sought to unmask a monster who had hidden in plain sight for far too long. Their testimonies, delivered with a quiet but unbreakable resolve, would eventually fill the void in that courtroom, turning the trial of a ghost into a landmark of international law. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is the mystery of Esad's current whereabouts. In 2018, intelligence reports began to circulate suggesting that he had been killed in an explosion in Syria. To many, this felt like the end of the story, a violent conclusion to a violent life. But the French legal system, guided by investigators who refused to let the trail go cold, realized that without DNA proof or a recovered body, Sabri Esed remained a ghost who could, theoretically, resurface at any moment. The possibility of him living a quiet life under a different name was a risk the court was not willing to take. They chose to proceed in absentia, a legal mechanism that ensures justice is recorded even when the perpetrator refuses to show his face. This decision turned the proceedings into something much larger than a typical criminal trial. It became a trial for history. It was an effort to document the concerted plan of the Yazidi genocide through the lens of a single man's actions. Every document filed, every survivor account recorded, and every forensic detail analyzed served to build a bridge between the quiet court in Paris and the dusty, blood-stained streets of the former caliphate. The evidence was not just about Sabri Esed. It was about the thousands of others who suffered the same fate, whose voices were silenced forever, and whose stories were now being told through the brave few who made it back to the light. As the trial unfolded over 5 days in March 2026, the sensory details of the survivors' accounts began to ground the abstract concepts of international law in a harrowing reality. They spoke of the scent of dust and gunpowder, the oppressive heat of the Syrian summer, and the constant, gnawing uncertainty of what the next hour would bring. They described Esed not as a grand warrior of a cause, but as a man who derived power from the total control of vulnerable souls. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a Frenchman who had traded his heritage for a role in a tragedy that would leave a piece of them missing forever. Yet, despite the darkness of these memories, there was a sense of resilience in the courtroom, a feeling that the truth was finally breaking through the silence. Before we move deeper into the specific evidence and the harrowing journey of the survivors from captivity to the French courtroom, I want to take a moment to welcome you back to the channel. I know many of you use these stories to find a sense of calm and perspective at the end of a long day, and I'm glad you're here with us as we explore the long road to justice for the Yazidi people. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Is it quiet where you are? Leave a comment below and let us know. It helps us feel a little less alone in the quiet hours as we navigate these complex histories together. The conviction of Sabri Esed was a hollow victory in some ways, given his presumed death, but for the survivors, it was an essential one. It provided the legal validation of their suffering that had been missing for over a decade. It formally recognized that what happened to them was not just a series of crimes, but a genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy their existence. This verdict ensured that if Esed is indeed still out there, hiding in the shadows of some distant city, he is now a marked man with a life sentence waiting for him. The ghost has been named, the crimes have been recorded, and the world is a little smaller for those who think they can escape the reach of justice. As we transition into the next phase of this narrative, visualizing the landscape of the Sinjar Mountains and the chaotic rise of the Islamic State, remember that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who emerge from normalcy. Sabri Esed was a man from the suburbs who chose to become a ghost of the caliphate. But in the end, it was the voices of those he tried to silence that brought him into the light. Close your eyes and let the rhythm of the story take you back to where it all began, as we retrace the steps of a journey defined by both the depths of human betrayal and the heights of human resilience. Justice has a way of finding its path, however long and winding the road may be. I hope that when you die, you will get the punishment you deserve from God. Those were the words that echoed through a silent Paris courtroom in March 2026, directed at an empty chair. The woman speaking those words was not looking at a monster in the flesh, but at a phantom. For nearly a decade, Sabri Esed had been a ghost, a high-ranking ISIS official who was widely presumed to have perished in a Syrian explosion back in 2018. But the French justice system and the survivors who had lived through a specialized kind of hell were not content to let his crimes simply vanish into the desert sand. Without a body and without a drop of DNA to prove he was no longer a threat to the world, the court faced a choice that would define the legacy of international law. They decided to hold a historic trial for the Yazidi genocide, making Sabri Esed the first French national to be formally charged with a concerted plan for extermination. It was a moment that transcended the standard terrorism charges the world had become accustomed to. This wasn't just about a man who joined a radical group. It was about a man who participated in the systematic destruction of an entire people. For the 5 Yazidi women and their 8 children who sat in that courtroom, the absence of a physical defendant didn't make the proceedings any less real. In fact, the empty chair seemed to amplify the weight of their testimony, a silent testament to the thousands who could no longer speak. The stakes of this trial were immense, reaching far beyond the borders of France or the borders of Iraq. If a high-ranking official like Esed could disappear into the fog of war without a legal reckoning, then the very concept of international justice was at risk. The court was tasked with deciding if the crimes committed between 2014 and 2016 in the dusty streets of Raqqa and the villages of Iraq were merely the byproduct of war, or if they were part of a calculated, horrific strategy. How did a boy born in Toulouse in 1984, a child of the French Republic, become the face of such a dark chapter in human history? The man known to his followers as Abu Dojana al-Faransi was not a foot soldier. He was a propaganda master and a high-ranking administrator in the so-called caliphate. He had been a phantom for so long that his name had become synonymous with the untouchable nature of the ISIS leadership. But as the trial unfolded, the survivors began to fill in the gaps of his missing years. They described a man who bought and sold human beings with the cold efficiency of a merchant, a man who used his own stepson in propaganda videos to show the world that the next generation of hate was already being groomed. The question that hung over the 5-day trial in March 2026 was one that many in the intelligence community had debated for years. If the explosion in 2018 didn't kill him, where is Sabri Esid now? Is he a pile of unidentifiable ash in the Syrian desert? Or is he hiding in plain sight, waiting for the world to forget his name? By sentencing him to life imprisonment in absentia, the Paris Criminal Court sent a message that the world would not forget. They ensured that if he ever tries to re-emerge from the shadows, a cell is already waiting for him. But before we can understand the verdict, we have to go back to the beginning, to the quiet streets of Toulouse, where the seeds of this radicalization were first planted, long before the world ever heard the name of the man who would help lead a genocide. To understand the man who would become a key figure in a global tragedy, we have to look at the ground from which he grew. Toulouse, in the mid-1980s, was a city defined by its terracotta rooftops and the gentle winding of the Garonne River. It was a place of vibrant markets and quiet, sun-drenched squares. In 1984, this was the world Sabri Esid was born into. But as he grew, the light of southern France began to cast longer, darker shadows. In the quiet neighborhoods of southern France, a shadow was lengthening, fueled by an ideology that saw the world not in colors, but in the binary of life and absolute destruction. For Esid, the path toward radicalization wasn't a sudden leap. It was a slow, steady erosion of his connection to the society around him. He began to find a sense of belonging not in the French Republic, but in the fringe radical circles that were quietly taking root in the city's outskirts. By the time he reached his 20s, Esid was no longer just a spectator to extremism. He had become deeply embedded in the Artegat network, a notorious recruitment pipeline named after a small village in the Ariège region. This wasn't just a group of angry young men talking in basements. It was a sophisticated operation designed to funnel fighters from the heart of Europe into the brewing conflicts in Iraq. It was here that Esid forged a bond that would later haunt the French national consciousness. His connection to the infamous Merah brothers. Abdelkader and Mohammed Merah were more than just associates. They were the architectural peers of Esid's radical worldview. In these circles, the air was heavy with a specific kind of resentment, a feeling that they were soldiers in a war the rest of the world hadn't yet realized was happening. They spent their days discussing theology through a distorted lens, and their nights planning for a future that had no place for the secular values of their home country. Investigators would later look back at these years as a period of missed opportunities. Esid was already on the radar of French intelligence. He was a known entity, a man whose movements were tracked and whose associations were documented in thick, dusty files. Yet, there is a certain stagnation that can set in within large bureaucratic systems. The unease was growing, but the threat still felt distant, contained within the borders of a subculture that most people chose to ignore. That changed in 2014. As the caliphate began to declare its existence across the borders of Syria and Iraq, the draw for men like Esid became irresistible. Despite being under surveillance, despite the years of red flags and police records, Sabri Esid managed to vanish. He slipped through the fingers of the authorities, moving through airport terminals like a ghost among holiday travelers. One day, he was a radicalized citizen of Toulouse. The next, he was a foot soldier for a rising terror state. The realization by French authorities that one of their own had not just left, but had become a cornerstone of a terrorist propaganda machine, was a bitter pill to swallow. It wasn't just that he had escaped. It was that he had taken his family with him, including his young stepson. They had traded the safety of France for the brutal certainty of the desert, and in doing so, Esid had transitioned from a local extremist to an international war criminal. As he crossed the border into Syria, the man from Toulouse was gone. In his place was Abu Dojana al-Faransi, a name that would soon be whispered in the halls of justice for reasons far more horrific than anyone in those quiet French neighborhoods could have imagined. At the time, the world was focused on the borders and the battles, but for the Yazidi people living thousands of miles away on the slopes of Mount Sinjar, the arrival of men like Esid signaled the beginning of an era of absolute darkness. If you're still awake and listening, take a moment to settle deeper into your blankets. Many of you have followed these cases for a long time, and I'd love to hear in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. It's a quiet night here, and I'm glad we're exploring this journey together. The story was no longer about a radicalized youth in a terracotta city. It had become something much larger, a grim blueprint for the destruction of an entire people. And as Esid began his new life in the heart of the conflict, the French intelligence services were left to wonder how a monster had been allowed to hide in plain sight for so long, and what he was truly capable of now that the restraints of civilization were finally gone. The transition from a radicalized drifter in the streets of Toulouse to a high-ranking officer in a global terror network was remarkably swift, but it was not an accident. Sabri Esid knew exactly how to market himself. In the shifting sands of the Syrian conflict, he shed his birth name like a useless skin, emerging instead as Abu Dojana al-Faransi. It was a title designed for the camera, a brand that signaled his French origin and his unwavering commitment to a cause that had already begun to stain the world red. In those early months of 2014, while the world was still trying to grasp the sheer scale of the territorial expansion in the Middle East, Esid was busy carving out a niche for himself within the internal security apparatus of the occupied territories. He wasn't just another soldier lost in the chaos of the front line. He was becoming a face that the French intelligence services would later come to recognize with a sense of profound dread. By the time 2015 arrived, the digital reach of the propaganda machine had reached a terrifying level of sophistication. It was no longer just grainy, handheld footage from the battlefield. These were high-definition productions, edited with the precision of a cinematic thriller, and Esid was one of their most useful assets. However, nothing could have prepared the international community for the video that surfaced in March of that year. It began like many others, with the vastness of the desert stretching toward a hazy horizon and the rhythmic hum of wind against a microphone. But as the camera panned, the screen flickered with a high-definition nightmare, showing a child forced into a role no human should ever hold, directed by the man who called himself his father. The child was Esad's young stepson, a boy barely old enough to understand the weight of the weapon he was being forced to hold. In the video, Esad stands behind him, a looming presence in camouflage, his voice calm and rhythmic as he delivers a chilling monologue in French. He speaks of the inevitability of their victory and the end of those he considers enemies, all while using his own family as a prop for absolute depravity. The horrifying moment concludes with the child being forced to participate in a public execution. The sheer contrast between the domesticity of a father-son relationship and the cold-blooded nature of their crimes in the desert sent shockwaves across the globe. It was a calculated move, a recipe for disaster designed to show that the next generation was already being forged in the fires of their ideology. Investigators who spent decades on these files all noticed the same chilling pattern. Esad was not just participating in the violence, he was curating it, turning the most sacred bonds of family into a tool for psychological warfare. As his prominence grew, Esad's role shifted from that of a public face to a more administrative, internal function. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was becoming an administrator of the nightmare. He moved into the management of the occupied territories, specifically within the internal security branches. This was the kind of place where the silence of the desert was often broken by the sound of gravel under heavy boots or the static, heavy radio chatter of patrols. Esad's work involved the systematic organization of life and death under the new regime. He was responsible for maintaining the order of the territories, which meant the brutal suppression of any perceived dissent and the oversight of the logistics required to keep the machine running. According to later reports, this administrative role gave him a unique level of access and authority. He was involved in the Hisbah, the religious police who enforced the most rigid and violent interpretations of their laws. It was here that the monster in plain sight truly began to exercise his power over the vulnerable. He was no longer just a man with a gun. He was a bureaucrat of terror, a man who understood that true control came from the ability to buy, sell, and manage the lives of others as if they were nothing more than inventory. This shift into the internal security framework would eventually lead him directly to the slave markets, where the fates of thousands of Yazidi women and children were being decided in the shadows of the Syrian desert. While many viewed him as a soldier of the caliphate, those who were later able to escape his grasp described him differently. To them, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who could speak of religious purity one moment and commit the most heinous acts of abuse the next. The air in those administrative centers was often heavy with the scent of dust and unwashed sweat, a place where common sense went out the window and was replaced by a rigid, unyielding cruelty. As we continue to look into the layers of this case, it becomes clear that Esad's rise was a deliberate journey toward the heart of a genocide, a path paved with propaganda and maintained through the cold, calculated management of human suffering. If you're still awake and listening, let me know where you're joining us from tonight. There's still a long road ahead in this search for justice. In the early hours of August 3rd, 2014, the world for the Yazidi people changed forever. For centuries, this ancient religious minority had lived in the Sinjar region of northern Iraq. maintaining a culture that was as resilient as the rugged landscape they called home. But that morning, the silence of the dawn was broken by the approach of armored vehicles and the rhythmic thud of heavy weaponry. ISIS forces had arrived with a specific, calculated intent not just to conquer territory, but to systematically erase an entire people from the map. As the fighters moved through the villages, they implemented a brutal efficiency that would later be recognized by the international community as the hallmark of genocide. Men were separated from their wives, and sons from their mothers. The old and the infirm were often left behind in the chaos, while those deemed valuable were herded into trucks and transport containers. Thousands of Yazidis fled toward the craggy peaks of Mount Sinjar, seeking refuge in a place that had protected their ancestors for generations. But the mountain, while providing a temporary sanctuary from the immediate violence, soon became a site of profound suffering. Under a relentless sun that reached temperatures of over 120 degrees, families were trapped without food, water, or medicine. The heat of the sun was a witness to a marketplace where the currency was suffering, and the inventory was the dignity of an entire ancient culture. While the world watched the humanitarian crisis unfolding on the mountain, a darker system was being constructed in the cities of the so-called caliphate. This was the establishment of the slave markets, or souks, where human lives were traded like common commodities. These weren't hidden back-alley transactions. They were organized bureaucratic events held in public buildings and private villas across ISIS-controlled Syria and Iraq. It was here that Sabri Esid moved from being a mere soldier of the propaganda machine to a direct participant in the machinery of human misery. Records and survivor testimonies show that Esid didn't just witness these markets from the sidelines. He was an active buyer, a man who navigated the rows of traumatized women and children with the cold precision of a merchant. For the survivors, the trauma of the initial assault was only the beginning of a long descent into darkness. They were stripped of their names, their identities, and their basic human rights. In these markets, women were categorized by age, appearance, and perceived value, their lives reduced to numbers on a ledger. The weight of the survivors' initial trauma as they were separated from their families and thrust into the darkness of ISIS-controlled Syria was immense, a burden that would define every moment of their lives for years to come. As it turned out, Esid's involvement was deeply personal and relentlessly cruel. He sought out specific families, purchasing women and their children to serve in his household in Raqqa. To Esid, these individuals weren't human beings with histories, dreams, and fears. They were property, symbols of his status within the extremist hierarchy. The evidence would later reveal that he treated these captives with a calculated lack of empathy, forcing them into a life of domestic servitude and systematic abuse. He was a man who understood the power of fear and used it to maintain total control over those he had purchased. The atmosphere in these slave markets was one of stagnant, suffocating despair. The air was thick with the scent of dust and unwashed bodies, punctuated by the occasional sharp command of an ISIS guard. For the Yazidi women, the transition from the familiar hills of Sinjar to the cramped, sun-scorched rooms of Syria was a jarring, terrifying shift. They were miles away from everything they knew, held in a place where the rules of the civilized world had been discarded in favor of a medieval brutality. Investigators would later find that the systematic nature of these markets was a key component of the concerted plan to destroy the Yazidi people, as it aimed to break the communal bonds and reproductive future of the group. If you're still awake and listening, take a deep breath and feel the safety of the room around you. The stories we are exploring are heavy, but they are a necessary part of understanding the long road toward justice. Sabri Esid's journey through the slave markets of Syria was not just a personal choice. It was a reflection of a larger, darker ideology that sought to commodify the soul of an entire people. He moved through these markets with an air of entitlement, a wolf in sheep's clothing who believed that his actions would never be scrutinized by the outside world. But the survivors were watching, recording every detail in their memories, waiting for the day when their voices would finally be heard in a court of law. By the time the international community began to grasp the full scale of the atrocities, Esid had already established a household built on the foundations of enslavement. The women he purchased were forced to learn the doctrines of their captors, their own faith and language suppressed under the threat of violence. Yet, even in the deepest shadows of their captivity, a quiet resilience remained. These 5 survivors, whose testimonies would eventually bring Esid to justice, began to find ways to support one another, sharing whispers of hope and planning for a future that seemed nearly impossible to reach. Their journey from the sun-bleached ruins of Sinjar to the courtroom in Paris is a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of absolute darkness. The weight of a historical conviction often rests on the shoulders of those who were never meant to survive. In the case of Sabri Esid, the legal architect of his own downfall wasn't a forensic scientist in a lab or a high-ranking intelligence officer, but rather 5 Yazidi women and their 8 children. These individuals would later become the living heart of the prosecution, transforming from victims of a systemic horror into the primary witnesses of a genocide. For years, their identities were shielded by the fog of war, known only by initials in restricted dossiers. But their collective memory was as sharp as the desert sun. Between 2014 and 2016, these families were moved like pieces on a grim chessboard across the borders of Syria and Iraq, held in a captivity that was designed to do more than just imprison them. It was designed to erase them. The accounts they provided to organizations like FIDH and Kinyat were not just stories of individual pain. They were a roadmap of a concerted plan. One survivor recalled being purchased in a crowded market where the air was thick with heat and the smell of exhaust, only to be taken to a home where Esid reigned with a cold, legalistic cruelty. This wasn't the chaotic violence of a battlefield. This was the quiet, terrifyingly organized violence of a household where every act of abuse was justified by a perverse interpretation of law. The women documented how Esid didn't just see them as property, but as symbols of a culture he was tasked with dismantling. They were not just numbers in a case file. They were 5 voices that refused to be silenced by the weight of the sand or the cruelty of their captor. Day after day, under the constant threat of being moved or sold again, these 5 women performed an incredible feat of mental preservation. They memorized the layout of the houses where they were kept, the names of the men who visited, and the specific dates of the horrors they endured. One mother spoke of how she would whisper stories of their home on Mount Sinjar to her children at night, a desperate attempt to keep their Yazidi identity alive, while Esed tried to force a new, radicalized reality upon them. The 8 children, some of whom were only infants when the ordeal began, grew up in the shadow of a man who viewed their very existence as an affront to his caliphate. Yet, in the face of this, the mothers remained vigilant, documenting every detail of their abuse with a forensic precision that would one day stun the Paris criminal court. As investigators later realized, Esed's actions were far from random. The evidence gathered from these survivors pointed toward a concerted plan, a legalistic system aimed at the total destruction of the Yazidi people. It involved the forced separation of families, the systematic renaming of children, and the use of sexual violence as a tool of war. By the time the case reached the French authorities, the testimonies of these 5 women had created a mountain of evidence that was impossible to ignore. They had worked with groups like Kinyat, an organization dedicated to documenting ISIS crimes, to ensure that every scar and every memory was recorded for history. It took a quiet, monumental strength to relive those years in Syria and Iraq, to sit in small rooms with investigators and recount the moments when hope felt miles away. The possibility of justice seemed like a distant dream during those long nights in Raqqa, where the sound of rhythmic water dripping from a leaky pipe was often the only clock they had. But as it turned out, their meticulousness would be Esed's undoing. They remembered the way he spoke, the French phrases that peppered his commands, and the specific ways he exerted control over their daily lives. By documenting the slave markets and the domestic prisons Esed maintained, they proved that he was a vital gear in the machinery of genocide. Friends and family back in the Sinjar region had been lost, but these survivors carried the history of their people in their testimonies. The story of these 5 survivors is the kind of story that reminds us why the pursuit of justice can never be abandoned, even when the perpetrator is a ghost. They stood before the world not as broken figures, but as the ultimate authority on the truth of what happened in the desert. As we move forward into the trial that followed, let me know if you've ever been moved by the resilience of someone who stood up against impossible odds. Leave a comment below. It's a reminder that even in the darkest hours, the truth has a way of finding the light. Their courage ensured that the world would finally recognize the Yazidi genocide for what it was. Not a tragedy of chance, but a calculated crime that required a historic response. The transition from victim to witness is a journey that usually begins in the smallest, most quiet moments of defiance. For the 5 women who had been held by Sabri Esed, that journey began in the shadows of a collapsing caliphate. By 2016, the physical landscape of the Islamic State was shrinking, but the psychological walls Esed had built around his captives remained formidable. He moved through the shadows of the war zone like a ghost, shifting his household between Iraq and Syria with a calculated frequency that was designed to disorient. One survivor recalled being moved under the cover of night, hidden in the back of trucks, crossing borders that had become nothing more than lines of dust and blood. To the world, Esed was a vanishing specter, a name on a watch list that seemed to lead nowhere. But to the women he held, he was an inescapable reality, a man who used his self-appointed status as a religious authority to turn their suffering into a divine mandate. This was the core of his psychological warfare. Esed didn't just use physical force. He used the weight of his ideology to crush the spirit of those he enslaved. He would tell the women that their plight was written, that their status as Yazidis made their enslavement a matter of spiritual law. It was a specialized kind of cruelty, one that sought to convince the victims that even God had turned away from them. He would sit in the living rooms of requisitioned houses in Raqqa or Ash-Shafa, lecturing on the purity of his cause while his young stepson, the boy the world saw in those chilling propaganda videos, watched from the corners. For the survivors, every day was a lesson in survival against a man who believed his own shadow was holy. Yet, as they were moved from one safe house to another, they began to notice the cracks. They saw the frantic way the ghost packed his bags. They heard the distant, muffled explosions that signaled the front lines were drawing closer. They realized that the man who claimed to be a representative of an eternal kingdom was, in fact, a man who was very much afraid of the light. The escapes were not grand cinematic moments. They were desperate, terrifying gambles taken in the dead of night. One of the women described the heart-pounding silence of slipping past a sleeping guard, her breath shallow and jagged, her children clutched so tightly to her chest that she feared they might cry out from the pressure. They moved through fields of scorched earth, guided only by the distant flashes of artillery and a primal instinct for the Kurdish lines. When they finally reached safety, they didn't just bring themselves. They brought the secrets of the caliphate. They carried the names, the locations, and the specific idiosyncratic habits of the man who had called himself Abu Dojana al-Faransi. It was in these refugee camps and debriefing rooms that the transition truly took hold. As they spoke to investigators from organizations like Kinyat and the FIDH, the fear that had defined their lives began to morph into a different kind of power. They were no longer just pieces of property in Esed's distorted world. They were the primary evidence in a mounting case of genocide. French investigators, working thousands of miles away, began to piece together a digital and physical trail that Esed thought he had burned behind him. They documented the transfers of money, the movements across the border, and the harrowing consistency in the survivors' stories. Even as reports began to surface in 2018 that Esed had been vaporized in a massive explosion, the legal team refused to let the ghost rest. They knew that a death without a body is just another shadow to hide in. The survivors held the physical and emotional scars that the law could finally track, providing a forensic map of a crime that transcended mere terrorism. They were the ones who could point to a photo and say, "This is the man who bought me." And in that simple act of identification, the ghost was pulled back into the world of men, where he could finally be judged. As we look at the legacy of these survivors, it's hard not to feel a sense of profound respect for the weight they carried. If you're still awake and listening, you might be wondering how a man so careful to remain hidden could leave such a clear trail. It's because he underestimated the one thing his ideology couldn't account for: the human will to be remembered. Before we move into the final, explosive moments of Ecid's known life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that justice can truly be served when the accused isn't there to face it? Or is the verdict itself the most important part of the healing? Let me know in the comments. It helps us keep the conversation going in these quiet hours. The landscape of eastern Syria in late 2018 was a jagged mosaic of pulverized concrete and scorched earth. As the so-called caliphate began to contract into a final, desperate sliver of territory along the Euphrates River, the fog of war became almost literal. In the village of Ash-Shafa, the air was perpetually heavy, tasting of limestone dust and the metallic tang of spent munitions. It was here, amidst the crumbling skeletons of once ordinary homes, that the trail of Sabri Ecid, the man the world had come to know as a ghost, reached a violent, ambiguous crossroads. If you're still awake and listening, we are about to move into the 5 days that changed everything, the trial itself. I'd love to know how you're feeling as we approach the resolution of this journey. Leave a comment and let me know where you're joining us from tonight. It's good to have you here in the quiet. The air in Paris during that second week of March 2026 was crisp, a lingering winter chill that seemed to settle into the very stone of the Palais de Justice. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was unlike any other terrorism trial the city had seen in recent years. Usually, these high-security proceedings are filled with the heavy presence of the accused, the tension of a potential outburst, or the cold stare of a radicalized man. But for the trial of Sabri Ecid, the most striking feature was the void. There was an empty chair where the defendant should have been, a silent wooden testament to a man who had vanished into the dust of a Syrian explosion years prior. Yet as the judges took their seats, the room didn't feel empty. It felt crowded by the weight of a history that was finally, after 12 long years, being given a name. The 5 days that followed were a masterclass in bravery. 5 Yazidi women, survivors of a nightmare that most of the world only saw in grainy propaganda clips, traveled to France to stand before the highest level of European justice. As they walked into the chamber, the silence in the room was so heavy you could hear the heartbeat of the survivors as they stood to face that empty chair and a full bench of judges. Their hands were trembling, some clutching small pieces of fabric or photos of the children who had been with them in captivity, but their voices remained firm. They were no longer the sabaya, the property that Ecid had bought and sold in the markets of Raqqa. They were witnesses. They were the primary evidence of a concerted plan to destroy an entire people. One by one, they recounted the years between 2014 and 2016. They spoke of the humid, terrifying days in Syria and Iraq when Ecid moved them from house to house like livestock. They described the wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who presented himself as a holy warrior to his peers, but acted as a monster in the shadows of his own home. According to their testimonies, Ecid's cruelty wasn't random, it was systematic. He didn't just abuse them, he attempted to strip them of their identity, their faith, and their humanity. As it turned out, the prosecution had meticulously mapped these accounts against captured ISIS documents, showing that Esed wasn't just a lone actor. He was a cog in a machine designed for genocide. The prosecution's closing argument was a moment of profound catharsis for everyone in the gallery. The lead prosecutor didn't just focus on the individual acts of violence, as horrific as they were. Instead, they spent hours defining the concerted plan. They argued that what happened to these 5 women was part of a larger, darker ambition to destroy the Yazidi people, in whole or in part. By the time the prosecution reached its conclusion, the legal definition of genocide felt less like a dry statute and more like a living, breathing truth that filled the courtroom. They spoke of the special place in hell reserved for those who use children as props for hate, referencing the infamous video of Esed's stepson, and argued that a life sentence was the only way to ensure the legacy of his victims was protected. Outside the thick walls of the Palais, the rhythmic sound of a spring rain had been tapping against the windows all morning, a somber backdrop to the harrowing details of the slave markets. But as the final survivor finished her testimony and sat back down, the rain stopped. In the sudden, shimmering quiet that followed, the first chirp of a bird echoed from the courtyard outside, cutting through the tension. It was a small, sensory reminder that while the trial dealt with the darkest corners of human nature, the world outside was still turning. And for these women, a new chapter was finally beginning. They had looked into the void where their oppressor should have been, and they had spoken their truth to power. Investigators would later remark that the bravery shown in those 5 days provided a blueprint for how to handle ghost defendants. Even without a body to put in a cell, the court was creating a paper trail that would follow Esed into eternity. Records show that every detail was scrutinized, from the dates of the slave auctions to the specific phrases Esed used to justify his crimes. The survivors were safe now, and as the trial moved toward its verdict, there was a collective sense of relief. The justice system, which many feared might fail due to the lack of a physical defendant, was instead rising to the occasion. The story of Sabri Esed was no longer just a mystery of a missing jihadist. It was the story of a landmark victory for a people who had been told for years that their suffering didn't have a legal name. As we move toward the final verdict and the legacy of this life sentence, rest assured that the voices heard in that Paris courtroom changed the course of history forever. The morning of March 20th, 2024, arrived in Paris with a quiet, persistent chill that seemed to settle deep within the stone walls of the Palais de Justice. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with a heavy, expectant silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. For the 5 Yazidi survivors and their families, this date was more than a mark on a calendar. It was the culmination of years of unimaginable suffering and a long, exhausting journey toward a truth that many feared would never be officially acknowledged. They sat together, their faces etched with a weary resilience, waiting for the words that would later define a new chapter in international law. At the time, the courtroom felt small compared to the vastness of the crimes being discussed. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they were closed, sealing the world outside and focusing all attention on the bench. When the judges finally entered, the rustle of their robes was the only sound in the room. The presiding judge looked out over the gallery, her expression calm but firm, holding the weight of a history that stretched far beyond the borders of France. The judge's voice didn't shake when she delivered the sentence. It was the sound of a closing door on a dark chapter of the 21st century. Sabri Essid was found guilty on all counts. For his role in the systematic enslavement, the repeated abuse, and the calculated destruction of a people, the court handed down the maximum possible sentence: life imprisonment. Under French law, this was a life for a legacy, a legal declaration that the man known as Abu Dojana al-Faransi was no longer a ghost or a propaganda figure, but a convicted genocidaire. The sentence carried a mandatory minimum of 22 years, ensuring that even if he were to be captured tomorrow, he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. It was unclear to many at the time how a sentence could be served by a man who was presumed dead, but the legal implications of a trial in absentia were profound. By refusing to close the file without a body, the French justice system sent a clear message to any who might follow in Essid's footsteps. Justice does not have an expiration date, and it does not recognize the convenient disappearance of a criminal. Records show that this was the first time in the nation's history that a French court formally recognized the Yazidi genocide. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the recognition of a concerted plan to destroy an entire ethnic and religious group. As the judge continued to read the findings, the sun began to break through the heavy gray clouds outside, casting long golden beams of light across the courtroom floor. It was a sensory grounding moment, a physical shift that seemed to mirror the emotional relief in the room. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was simple. The world had finally agreed on what had happened. The term genocide was no longer just a word used by activists or historians. It was now a matter of legal fact in a court of law. For the survivors, the possibility of being forgotten began to fade, replaced by the weight of a formal verdict that would remain in the annals of history forever. The prosecution had argued that Essid's actions were not random acts of cruelty, but part of a wider, organized machine designed to erase the Yazidi people from existence. The court agreed, noting that the evidence was overwhelming. As it turned out, the testimonies of the 5 women were the cornerstone of the case. They had described the slave markets, the systematic separation of families, and the way Essid had used his home as a prison. These details, though painful, were what allowed the judge to speak with such authority. Friends and family of the victims sat with their heads bowed, some shedding quiet tears, while others simply exhaled a long, deep breath that they seemed to have been holding for years. There is a sense of justice for history in a moment like this. Even if Essid never feels the cold metal of handcuffs on his wrists, his name is forever etched alongside the most notorious figures of the century. He is no longer a lion of the caliphate. He is a man convicted of the ultimate crime. Before we move toward the final reflections on this case, I want to take a moment to speak to those of you who are still awake and listening. Many who follow these stories feel that a life sentence in absentia is a hollow victory, while others see it as the only way to truly honor the survivors. I wonder which side you fall on. Let me know in the comments if you believe this verdict brings true closure, or if justice is only served when the cell door locks in person. Your perspective helps us understand the human side of these legal battles. As the session drew to a close, a soft, distant sound of bells could be heard from a nearby cathedral, drifting through the high windows of the Palais. It was a peaceful sound, one that signaled the end of a long day and the beginning of a quiet night. The survivors began to stand, their movements slow but certain. They walked out of the courtroom not as victims of a nameless tragedy, but as witnesses to a recognized genocide. They were leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into a world that, for the first time, had legally validated their pain. The story of Sabri Esid would later be taught in law schools as a landmark of international justice. But for those in the room that day, it was simply the moment the world finally listened. Would you like me to generate the final closure, the silent watch, 5900 to 6100, to complete the script? The courtroom in Paris, usually a place of sharp legal debate and the rustle of official papers, had fallen into a profound, heavy stillness. As the final echoes of the life sentence against Sabri Esid faded into the ornate woodwork of the ceiling, a new kind of silence took hold. Not the silence of a secret kept in the dark, but the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a truth that had finally been set in stone. The survivors, who had carried the weight of the Sinjar Mountains and the dust of Syrian prisons in their very bones, sat for a long moment in the gallery. They did not rush to the doors. There was no longer a need to hurry, no longer a need to run from a ghost that had finally been shackled by the steady hand of the law. Outside, the city of Paris continued its frantic pace, the lights of the evening traffic blurring into long ribbons of gold and red. But inside those thick stone walls, time seemed to stretch and settle. For years, the names of these women and their children had been spoken only in whispers, if they were spoken at all. They had lived in the kind of place where the air itself feels dangerous, where every shadow might be a man like Esid, returning to claim what he believed he owned. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon on this historic March evening, that fear began to dissolve into the cool evening air. The records now show, in ink that will never fade, that what happened to the Yazidi people was not just a tragedy or a series of unfortunate events, but a concerted plan of destruction. It was a genocide, and Sabri Esid, the Frenchman who thought he could hide behind the chaos of a falling caliphate, was now a man with a permanent address in the annals of criminal history. Whether he lies beneath the rubble of a Syrian desert or is wandering the earth as a nameless fugitive, he is no longer a shadow over the lives of those he harmed. He is a convicted man, a ghost with a tether, and the world is a little smaller and a little safer for it. The journey to this moment had been long, winding through the narrow streets of Toulouse, the training camps of the Middle East, and the sterile hallways of international high courts. It was a journey defined by the resilience of those who refused to let their stories be buried. At the time of the attacks in 2014, the world watched in horror as the smoke rose from the mountains. But as the years passed, the world often looked away. Yet the survivors never had that luxury. They lived with the memories every time they closed their eyes. They felt the absence of the family members who never came home, and they carried the scars of a betrayal by a man who had come from a land of liberty only to bring them chains. By the time the verdict was read, many of those children who had been held in Esid's house were now young adults, standing tall, their voices no longer trembling. They had seen the monster unmasked, and in the unmasking, they found a piece of themselves that had been stolen so long ago. As we look back on the legacy of this trial, we see more than just a legal victory. We see a restoration of the human spirit. The prosecution had argued that justice is a slow-moving river, but one that eventually carves its way through even the hardest rock. And as the lawyers packed their bags and the judges retreated to their chambers, that river had finally reached the sea. The possibility of peace, once a distant and shimmering mirage, was now a tangible reality. The farmhouses in the distance, where the survivors have found new homes and new lives, are quiet now. There is no more looking over the shoulder, no more jumping at the sound of a car door closing in the night. The silence of the night is no longer an enemy. It is a blanket, a soft and rhythmic companion to a rest that has been earned through fire and tears. The vastness of the justice system can sometimes feel cold and impersonal, but tonight, it feels like a warm hearth. It is a reminder that no matter how far a person travels into the heart of darkness, the light of accountability has a way of finding them. Sabri Esid's life sentence is a lighthouse for others who might think they can escape the consequences of their actions. It stands as a silent watchman over the history of the Yazidi people, ensuring that the world never forgets the names of those who suffered and the names of those who stood up to say, "No more." Friends and family who were lost are honored not just in memory, but in the very law of the land. The story of the French jihadist and the survivors who brought him to justice is a story of the ultimate triumph of the quiet over the loud, the soft over the hard, and the truth over the lie. If you are still awake and listening, let the weight of this resolution settle over you like a calm evening mist. The world is full of mysteries, and many of them are dark, but for every shadow, there is a light that refuses to go out. You have journeyed with us through the most difficult chapters, and you have reached the end of the road where the light is brightest. The air is cool and still, and the rhythmic hum of the world outside is just a distant murmur that has no power over the peace of this moment. The survivors are safe. The truth is recorded. The story is finished. Rest now. The farmhouses are quiet. The city streets are still. The desert wind carries only the softest whispers of the earth. The truth is no longer a secret. It is a law that stands as a silent watchman over the memory of the fallen and the lives of those who remain. You have followed the thread to its end, and there are no more knots to untie. The story is whole, the justice is served, and the night is yours to enjoy in peace. Sleep is a natural extension of this quiet, a place where the mind can finally rest after witnessing the long road to accountability. You are safe, the journey is over, and the world is at rest. If you are still with me, you may find peace in our next journey into the restorative power of justice. You are safe, and the story is finished. Would you like me to begin drafting the full script for Chapter 1? The radicalization of Toulouse, focusing on the 12-word anchor and the LLM-MS rhythm.